Hello everybody, I'm Dan Limbach from PharmaVoice, and I'd like to welcome you to today's event entitled Best Practices for Your Next Tracking Study, brought to you by PharmaVoice in partnership with our good friends at InCrowd. We have an outstanding crowd today with executives from across the industry. Thank you for investing the time to attend. We'll certainly do our very best to make it worth your while. We have a very knowledgeable panel of experts with us today to help us understand the many issues associated with tracking studies. Based on the turnout, this is clearly a popular topic, and it promises to be an extremely informative session. So let's meet our thought leaders from InCrowd. First, we have Caleb Costa, Senior Vice President for Client Success. Caleb is joined by Charlie Leonardo, Director for Training and Compliance. And finally, Remy Morrison, Account Director for Client Services and Syndicated Data. Caleb will be our host for the presentation, and he'll also moderate questions from the audience throughout the webinar. Caleb, you have the floor.
Thanks, Dan. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. We appreciate your choosing to spend your time with us today. And in exchange, we aren't going to sell our micro tracker or demo our product. If you'd like a demo, feel free to request one on our website. Rather, today we're going to spend our time sharing best practices. As such, please don't wait until the end of the webinar to ask questions. We're happy to try and answer those throughout the discussion. But we'll also have a Q&A at the end if needed. Very briefly, I'd like to share who we are for the folks on the call that might not know anything about InCrowd. We have the pleasure of partnering and collaborating with life sciences, insight, and brand professionals across a wide range of therapeutic areas every day. These clients seek to leverage research automation to improve the speed and access they traditionally have become accustomed to with hard-to-reach healthcare stakeholders. This in and of itself may not be completely unique outside of life sciences. However, our customers seek to leverage this automation while still maintaining the rigor and compliance adherence required by their complex regulatory environments. As a client success team, we take the information gleaned from working with our clients and share that with our application engineers to simplify and automate traditionally rigorous research processes. So, 10 years ago, had I told you that the world was changing and soon nearly half of working adults would exclusively get their news online and most frequently via mobile, you might have had a hard time believing it. Although now I'm fairly certain that most marketing and insight professionals recognize the speed at which information, good or bad, regarding their products or competitors travels in the market today. In August, political comments about Mylan's EpiPen dropped that stock by 6% in just a few minutes. And just this week, Bernie Sanders sends out a single tweet, and Ariad loses nearly $400 million in stock value. This happened on Monday for anybody not following the news. So the need for real-time problem identification and expedient response is more important now than ever before. And the very real contradiction here is that, as we all know, research budgets aren't growing nearly as fast as the business need for the information required to inform that strategic response. So let me be clear, this is not change for change's sake or a cry for checking the innovation box. Nearly every client we work with still maintains the need for traditionally, usually biannual ATUs. However, we are here today to talk about adding to the traditional and augmenting the great insight work that you're already doing. Before we jump into the core content, I'd like to just ask a quick poll to get a read on who we have with us today in terms of participants. So please answer this poll. Have you heard of real-time or micro-tracking before? So there's your data. Good. So for the 18%, feel free to drop off. You don't need to be here. And for the rest of you, we look forward to moving as efficiently as possible through this information. Please feel free to send any additional questions. So today we're going to cover designing successful real-time tracking studies. Remy Morrison is going to cover the design and the access of tracking data 24/7. And then Charlie Leonardo will focus on staying agile for prediction and preparation and assuring data integrity. With that, Remy, take it away.
Hi, everybody. Nice to talk to you today. A lot of you probably already know a lot about tracking studies, or at least the traditional kind, how customized ATUs and tracking studies are really meant to move people from a fire drill, knee-jerk reaction mode to a bigger picture, sane strategy mode. Now, unfortunately, marketers and market researchers have traditionally taken a turnkey, maybe even overly comprehensive approach to trackers, often trying to predict the questions that will be asked by internal stakeholders across the board, understanding what might be important to the business, but maybe not with a complete understanding. And what ends up happening is that they end up measuring more variables than those that are just key. The result is what we call a database survey. Basically a bulky and time-consuming tool which becomes a burden both for the responders and analysts and produces a lot of descriptive data but affords little in terms of strategic value. Now, a good tracking study aims to avoid this research rut by trimming out the fat and honing in on only what's essential. It should include only those core metrics and KPIs that tie directly back to a specific business objective or question. When designing your tracker, it's important to remember that you are what you measure. So you want to make sure that all the questions or tested attributes are tied back to an actual strategic outcome and, if at all possible, a stakeholder or stakeholders who are responsible for that outcome. Building this kind of tracker begins with a shared strategic purpose among all stakeholders and by starting at the end, where you hope that the tracker will take you, what you want to see and how you want to see the results, and then working backwards from there. So a broader strategy and desired outcome will form the basis of your tracker. For instance, a competitive promotional strategy review may examine detailing, messaging, samples, events, advertising, sales reps. Ad refinement and Salesforce optimization tracking usually provides an understanding of how companies target physicians and other healthcare providers recall and respond to key messages or themes of both its brand and its competitors over time, as well as the degree and direction of that impact. Longitudinal patient data analysis would focus on prescription activity, for instance, like new and total patient types, those who are new patients, switching patients, continuing patients, in addition to early views of compliance and persistency, out-of-pocket costs maybe, abandonment rates, and other drivers or obstacles to prescribing. And of course, the very common brand launch and or global commercial strategy trackers are likely to be focused on the market or competitive landscape, current treatments that are being used, unmet needs within a particular therapeutic category, as well as the payer environment and HCPs or practices' response to that. Now, in regards to specific question design, once you have an established strategic purpose for your tracker, most trackers will contain those core elements that measure awareness, usage, and attitudes. But specific strategic needs may direct the specific dimensions or measurements therein. So depending on your product or brand and the business strategy behind it, as well as factors like usage cycles, levels and types of competition, or the newness of a category or class, you may be focused on different kinds of awareness, use, or associations. For instance, unaided and aided brand awareness are essential questions for any ATU, but depending on the need and your needs and your situation, you may also need to understand respondents' awareness of products in development, for instance, or those that have recently launched. How often can doctors recall certain kinds of items in the news, or perhaps the degree of familiarity with different products or sources of awareness. These things might be important to you depending on what you're trying to achieve and what you need to measure. But whatever the case, internal stakeholders should carefully consider how and why the resulting data of a particular metric will be valuable before including it as a question or dimension in your tracker. This will help keep things tight, it will make respondents happier, and you'll actually have something that is useful to you on a regular basis. And that actually leads us to our next point, because when designing a real-time microtracker, it's also important to consider their nimble nature and their more frequent fielding periods. This approach lends itself very well to measurements that can help with both immediate triage in certain situations as well as long-term planning. It's well suited for tracking those KPIs, prescribing behaviors, and brand attributes or association whose needle is more likely to be volatile or the landscape is more likely to shift. So keep in mind which metrics will provide you with the best pulse of your brand that you'll be tracking on a regular basis. And finally, you want to make sure that your tracker will be most useful from a longitudinal standpoint as well, otherwise, what are you tracking? So from that standpoint, it's important that your questions and metrics remain constant and consistent wave to wave. Changing questions, especially within a micro tracker, can really upset the value of your measurements and the results that you're getting, even in regards to questions that are not the one that has been changed. Of course, that said, it's nice to maybe leave at the end of your micro tracker a space for module questions or talking about ad hoc issues or tracking a particular marketing campaign along its path for a few months, as needed. But the core of your tracker should remain consistent. And this takes us to the end goal, which really, this is something that you would have considered when designing your survey. What kind of reporting are you hoping to see? What kind of analysis are you going to have in mind? We ask a few questions here. For instance, can on-demand backend and longitudinal reporting be useful? We think that both can be incredibly useful. For instance, when it comes to responding faster to sudden changes or competitor events, quickly optimizing and refining marketing campaigns and Salesforce approaches. If you can see exactly in your data where you're failing or where you need to improve or what needs to be focused on or what doctors are looking for, you can respond quicker. That means that you can develop a more adaptable and tactical brand launch strategy or approach.
So we have a quick question from the audience.
Sure.
What types of events do you mean?
These could be events, for instance, new product launches in the market, FDA breakthrough designations, sudden approvals, sudden lawsuits even, or other market events, for instance, actually some of the ones that Caleb had just mentioned earlier, how those might be impacting your brand, especially if your brand is the target of those kind of events. So there's lots of things that can happen without any warning, without any forethought, that you hopefully can be prepared to measure its impact on a more regular basis using these kind of micro-trackers, real-time micro-trackers on a more frequent basis. Also, the benefit of having a very concise read on your audience and seeing where issues pop up. We, InCrowd at least, and this should be available to any kind of micro-tracking or micro-survey service, can do a follow-up or deep dive on issues that do come up and pop up of immediate importance. So you can get a deeper dive or deeper read on exactly how that event may have impacted things and support that with the data from your micro-tracker. The longitudinal reporting is also incredibly important because this will allow you to track and better see how you've improved on those issues that you've been working on in areas of improvement, or in some cases, the lack thereof. This will allow you to adapt more quickly, review the reactions and changes, and predict more accurately in the future how you should approach certain situations. We also asked, do you need continuous tracking and data? That would seem to answer itself in that we're talking about micro-trackers, but maybe what we don't think about all the time is that by doing consistent micro-trackers on a frequent basis, that can help you develop normative sets of data and other kind of baselines that will be able to help you track your progress on the long term and have something to measure by as you change and grow and add more products and use new messaging or ad campaigns. It can, in turn, actually allow you to develop a product, brand, or campaign health index even by having lots more data spread out over a much broader period of time, done quite frequently. Finally, we talk about when do you do granular cuts of data by select crowds and or waves. This is something, of course, you probably would have thought of when designing your survey and coming up with your target audience. You're going to want to have tools that allow you to see the data by the audiences or the crowds that you need to see, so you can identify differences, special areas, specialties themselves. Maybe it's regions or markets for you, so you can track where you need to focus most of your attention and efforts when employing any kind of strategy, be it marketing, be it a launch, be it sales support, so on and so forth. And that actually brings us to a small example of looking at these results. We've got our own real-time automation tools here at InCrowd, but right here what you see is a good example of how any developer or analyst with even a baseline understanding of Excel can take your results and set up an automated process that turns it into something very useful. This is a simple sheet that clearly illustrates wave over wave change, helps identify key data points or differences between crowds almost instantly just by a quick look at it, for a few questions that we had from one of our own syndicated studies, actually. Something like this was put together in a day, and thanks to the consistency of our tracker, we could easily add future waves of data to this and update it within an hour. This is this kind of plug-and-play analysis. Oh, we have a question.
Yep, one quick question. Can you explain the color coding?
For instance, in this one, we wanted to be aware of relative change wave to wave, so that's what you see those little arrows there under change. And the coloring here was just like a quick glimpse at positive or negative or very moderate wave to wave change in terms of percentage points. simple conditional formatting that's available in Excel, backed with formulas that can allow us to update this quite instantly and immediately point out to us where we want to focus our attention and see where the story is. Anyone can kind of put this together and develop this plug-and-play analysis that goes along with the micro-tracker so that not only are you doing real-time tracking, but you're getting real-time results that allow you to make faster and more informed decisions quicker. I guess with that, that's some of the methodology and analysis best practices that I want to share with you today. Of course, I'm available for questions. But here to speak more about the execution is my colleague, Charles Leonardo.
Great. Thanks very much, Remy. So to Remy's point, I just want to talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of this and how you can execute best practices for executing on a micro tracker. And when you're thinking about the timing and the frequency of when you want to launch these, there's a couple of things to consider. First and foremost is how does this relate to all the ATU work that you're doing, as Caleb mentioned earlier in the discussion. Based on my experience, folks are doing this probably once or twice a year and getting access to that data. So obviously there's big chunks of time where you're not really having any type of primary research and you're relying off of that data that might be dated. As such, I think myself included, when it comes to tracking metrics that matter to you for your job, no one wants to be surprised. So I think the key piece of insight here is to do the best you can to create a steady feedback loop with your target audience to not only avoid those surprises, but also proactively identify areas of risk so you can adapt appropriately. So, how do you mind that gap in time between getting your ATU data versus the needs that you have in your day-to-day business-making decisions? So, there's a few things to consider for that. There's, as Remy mentioned before, there can be shifting landscapes for you to consider. There can be maturity of the market, volatility of the market, as Remy had just mentioned. Some of the other unpredicted things that we didn't talk about would be, new indications that come out that could really have a significant effect either on your product or just have a massive impact on the market in general. So I think some things you can predict, other things you can't. So for the examples that we were just talking about. As such, what I've seen to be very successful is just a blend of either monthly launches for your micro tracker and focusing on either a few KPIs that you care about, seeing if the needle's moving. If you have a more mature market or there's less volatility, you can even opt for a quarterly launch of these types of studies. And then just as important, if potentially even more important, there's this ad hoc model. I know for the work that we do here at InCrowd, it's very easy for our folks to, at the click of a button, send out a pulse of their micro tracker. So when you have these instances where things are very unexpected and there's this gap of time where news is released or something happened and you simply don't know how the market is reacting, you have the ability to click a button. In a matter of a few hours, you start to see this data come back and become much more informed versus not having these types of real-time tools at your disposal, and you're kind of at the mercy of the market and can't really control the messaging that's out there. With that, if there aren't any other questions, I'll just shift to the next slide, which is...
Do you have one question that came in? In your experience, how quickly do these micro-tracker projects typically turn around?
It's a great question. In my experience, depending on the overall size of the sample that you're going to, it's these things can typically turn around in a couple of days, and you certainly start seeing data come back in a matter of hours. At that point, it's not a full sample yet, so the information is very much directional. But in the great unknown, when these unexpected events happen, even directional data can help either put your mind at ease or help you inform what the triage plan is, as Remy had mentioned before.
There's one more question. What's the most common frequency you encounter?
Most common is definitely monthly. I've seen folks that probably fall more into the market where there's a lot of things shifting. There's a lot of new information that's coming out often throughout the year. So the monthly launch date really helps those folks just fully wrap their arms around all the activity that's happening in the market and really stay on top of everything, essentially. Cool. So Moving from the frequency and the scheduling of these, we want to talk a little bit about data integrity. And the reality is everything we've been discussing is for naught if you don't have a high degree of confidence in the integrity of the data that you're analyzing. When we think about it here at InCrowd, we kind of break it up into 3 buckets. And regardless of if you're doing work with us, for any vendors that you are exploring, I would highly recommend all of these or some blend of these buckets that I'm going to talk about for you to consider. So the first thing is just respondent validation. You want to make sure that the folks that you're talking to are who they say they are, and you have a high degree of confidence in that. So some of the things that we recommend is a double opt-in process. So there's a multi-layer check that this person is the person that they say they are. And there are certain things that you can do to verify that: NPI number, medical license, so on and so forth. And then for us, and I'm sure with the vendors that you may or may not work with, there's an authentication process that happens because obviously, as we all know, when HCPs participate in research, they get paid. So I know that here we look at and verify banking information. So I think with the multi-layered approach that we have, we feel very good and strong about the folks that we have in our panel, and they are who they say they are, and I think the data suggests that as well. The second bucket is intelligent sampling. Not only just knowing who these folks are, but being able to grab a baseline level of demographics in terms of very simple things like specialties, subspecialties, patient volume, practice setting. Basic questions that I think HCPs are used to answering at the front end of any type of market research project that they're participating in. I think something that we focus on at InCrowd is trying to reduce the amount of redundancy in these types of surveys that go out. And intelligent sampling really helps us to do that. And as a best practice, highly recommend doing that. I think it improves the overall respondent experience, helps boost up response rates, so you can not only get higher quality data, but you can get it more quickly as well. The third piece is just ensuring quality throughout the entire life cycle of any project that you're doing. And a couple of best practices that we've seen in an automated perspective, there are a variety of variables that we look at as we're doing research. And if there's any type of box that we're looking at that we feel a respondent doesn't fall into what we consider a very high quality respondent, we kick that person out. So some of the things are pretty straightforward. It's things like flagging outlier responses, straight lining responses, looking at open-ended responses, things of that nature. But all that stuff for us is happening in an automated way, so we want to make sure that while the survey is fielding, we can boot out any respondents that we don't feel confident about. And just to double down on that validation process, we always recommend when the survey is done fielding, you have a trained professional looking at the data to make sure that everything looks good. And it's really just a kind of a secondary check on the data to make sure it's of high quality and there's nothing in there that sticks out that could affect your analysis.
We have one more question that just came through. Can you talk more about your best practices for data validation on a survey level? Does that happen in real time?
It does, yeah. So we kind of have a multi-pronged approach for doing that. It does happen in real time when here at InCrowd, not only does it benefit our clients when they launch a survey, they can see the data as it comes in real time. We have folks internally that is also looking at that data, specifically from a validation perspective.
Yeah, and in terms of data quality in particular at the survey level, we build a proprietary algorithm that basically looks at some of the components here, among others, that build a cheater score. So together it kind of gives us a cheater score to determine flagging folks that need to have a kind of another look by a human. I think part of research automation is recognizing what computers do well and what humans need to do. You can automate rigorous research processes, but sometimes, especially when you're looking at qualitative responses at the survey level, you need to read those things. A human that understands context needs to read it and better understand whether or not, the larger picture is one of quality or that person needs invalidation. So the technology acts as a trigger to help us identify in real time where to look, and then a human takes it from there. Cool. Great. So we have one more poll to ask the audience. How often do you have follow-up questions after reviewing ATU data? Okay, great. Let's pull up those results. Wow, occasionally, it feels like very few people never have ATU.
About half the time at least.
Yeah. That's interesting. I mean, waiting for the next wave of the ATU or the next big quant study to attach a few unanswered questions can be frustrating, from our clients. And this is another example of where ongoing pulsing can help as the opportunity to engage more frequently, if done well, can augment, your traditional research processes and help. Okay. We believe market research should be an ongoing dialogue with our customers, with your customers, and with brand teams now employing many innovative methods and modalities, including real-time primary, community research, social listening, and so on. Regardless of the approach you take to identify and respond to market shifts, if you take away anything from today's discussion, we hope it's the following. The needle does move faster now than twice a year. And it's up to you to determine how valuable it may be to your brand to inform response as those dynamics shift. You are what you measure, and you have to decide. Great research automation can help you predict accurately and respond faster than in the past, and this is key, you know your business better than we do, and application engineers build tools that automate research process, not the upfront thinking necessary to determine what it is that you measure. And finally, short and fast doesn't mean inaccurate. And long and slow doesn't mean high quality. Data quality is vital when businesses are predicting major response and strategy on those results, whether it's a 50-minute conjoint or a 5-minute microsurvey. Regardless of which vendor you choose to work with, don't accept a black box. Ask to see what's under the hood. Anyone automating properly should be able to share how they're doing it. Thank you all for joining us today. I'll go to see if we have any additional questions, but we really appreciate your spending time with us. Feel free to ask any additional questions that you have. If we didn't have an opportunity to get to those questions, oh wait, here we go. How large of a sample is needed for something like this?
Wow, I mean, that really depends on who you're going out to and what you're trying to measure. If you have multiple audiences, and especially if it's important to look at results by those audiences or by regions or by patient types, then you're going to need more than someone who is just going out to one type of specialist, one type of HCP on something quite broad. So again, that goes back and forth, and I know that when it comes to working with our clients, we always sit down and have a very big discussion about who they're going after specifically, making sure that we have the right screeners in place and the right targeting parameters in place that are what we call our crowd wizard to identify them. And it can be as brief. I've seen in weekly trackers 25 to 30 a week or biweekly, a little bit more usually. I think an average probably would be around 50 for the monthly trackers. But then when we move into multiple groups, multiple crowds, it might be sparsed out anywhere between like 30 and 50 per group on a monthly basis.
I mean, we've done about 60 unique trackers in the last few months,
that's right.
And it's over 180 waves of those trackers. And based on that, I'd say the average ranges between 40 and 50 completes per wave. These are usually off target lists, matched target lists that our brand teams are sharing with us, and specifically wanting to make sure that you pull in, fresh sample, wave over wave, and so on and so forth. There are clear best practices in that space to ensure, based on the kinds of questions, you're not getting the same folks answering repetitively.
Exactly.
So it's important to make sure that you're building tools effectively that bring in fresh sample. And I think we have a couple of questions around physician panel and things like that. I mean, the truth is, InCrowd's technology is agnostic. So not only do we have internal panel, but we work with some of the largest sample providers out there. What's key about research automation is building tools that you can use in a broad capacity to ultimately get at the client's needs. So we use a combination of internal sample and key strategic partners across the U.S. and globally to be able to ensure we're meeting the need of our very discerning healthcare clients based on their tracking needs across many, many therapeutic categories. Does this method limit you to asking only simple, closed-ended questions? No, I think quite the opposite. Nowadays, I think it's become this is one of those things where 10 years ago, if you were doing real-time polling and micro-surveys, you were the only person doing them. Now there's a lot of tools, there's a lot of technology out there in the market that asks every kind of question you could possibly imagine really well. So the kinds of questions that we develop and design are the same kinds of questions that you could use and ask in any other survey tool out there. The real technique that you bring into play here is targeting the right people using the application, making sure that you're building things in an efficient and automated way and sampling in that way.
And I'd add asking, my whole spiel, asking intelligent questions. I've been continuously surprised with, I used to design large trackers, and now designing micro trackers and other micro surveys, the outstanding amount of data that you can collect within 4 to 5 questions. Not only do we have lots of functionality which allows you to be very intelligent and creative with your question design, but including comments and requiring certain follow-ups within the same question, you walk away with I don't even know how to describe it, reams and boxes worth of data and insights from a nice short survey that respondents enjoy taking.
And that's actually an interesting point, just quickly about, this question was about closed-ended questions. I think that more and more you're seeing the need for qualitative response along with the quantitative response. There has yet to be a tool that I've found on the market that truly does text analytics well. And by well, I don't mean just counting words. Plenty of tools count words well, but given the nature of the healthcare customer that we work with and the importance of context around each of their brands, I've yet to find a solution that really does text analytics quickly well. You can get general sentiment, you can get some count feedback, but context is something computers have yet to really figure out. I'm hopeful, being someone who embraces technology, that in my lifetime we'll get there. But as of yet, we don't have that. So we still manually code all our open ends for our clients when we're doing reporting outside of the application. They can either do that on their own or we do that for them. It's part and parcel with delivering insight.
And I would just add to that too, careful consideration when creating a coding scheme up front will allow you to make that process much more seamless and go quicker in future waves.
Yes, so one more question. How have you seen micro-tracking evolve in your experience over the past year?
Wow, that's a...
Yes, that's an interesting question. I think that it's just the nature of our clients to adopt solutions slowly and carefully, as opposed to just quickly changing what they've done traditionally.
Over the past year, what I've seen, which is really encouraging for us and just for the industry in general, is that we've kind of seen this idea of micro-tracking grow very quickly from its infancy state to be, in my experience, a lot of the clients that I work with, something that they rely on a monthly basis. So not only is it something where early adopters are coming and using this new technology, it's becoming more of the norm for more of our clients, which is really exciting, to the point where they wouldn't know what they would do without it, which is great news.
Yeah, it is. And as more and more people adopt, and I think that's the piece that's coming into play, folks see the value in having to take other forms and modalities that they're looking at and verify that information. So as they use social listening tools and they identify potential issues in the market, they can use tools like this that really focus on primary with their customers and better validate what they're hearing elsewhere. So that seemed to be the last question. As I mentioned earlier, please feel free to email us at the email address on your page for additional information or a demo or anything else you'd like to see. Thank you all for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.